Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session in the MCIE and Brooks Publishing Inclusive Early Childhood Education Online Training Series. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Barb Gruber from MCIE, and I will be your facilitator for this session. During this session, you will be muted, and you can type questions in the chat window, and those will be answered either as they come up or at the end of the session. This is a reminder that by joining us today, you will hear the live session and have an opportunity to ask the presenter questions. You will also be receiving a copy of the presenter's book, a certificate of attendance, and the link for the recording of today's session. And today's session is Building Blocks for Teaching Preschoolers with Special Needs with Dr. Ilene Schwartz. Ilene has been a friend of mine for many years. Her official MO is that she's a professor in the area of special education at the University of Washington and the director of the Herring Center for Research and Training in Education at UW. She is dedicated to building inclusive schools and societies and views inclusion as the celebration of diversity put into action. She is proud of what she and her colleagues have accomplished at the Herring Center, where research, training, and service are integrated to provide world-class early learning experiences to children with and without disabilities. So, Ilene, it is my pleasure to turn this session over to you. Let me switch into your presentation.
Well, thank you, Barb, and thank you for inviting me to do this today. I'm always excited to be able to talk about building blocks, and just to give you some background about building blocks, this came out of work from the Early Childhood Research Institute on Inclusion that was funded by OSEP many years ago. And the purpose of that grant was to look at what are the barriers and facilitators for inclusive practice. And in doing that, what we came up with was this framework, and it's a framework, not a curriculum, which is important to make the distinction. It's a framework that the purpose of it for us is to help all teachers include all children. And we really do talk about all means all, and that every strategy we talk about in this program can be used with children with and without disabilities. So with that, I'm going to take it away, and again, if you have any questions, please let us know. And I am going to leave some time at the end for questions, but we will. I'd be happy. I hope that you have some questions we can address. So the building blocks model provides a set of educational practices to help teachers do a more effective job of including all children in early childhood classrooms. And we really talk about that we really want to emphasize that it's all children, and that one of the things that and that could include anything from a home, a family child care to a Head Start program to a preschool run by a public school program. That the idea is that what we want to do is really think about what do children need in order to be full participants in the programs in which they spend time, and what strategies can we use and what can we put in place to make sure that children with disabilities have access to the same kind of early childhood programs that they would have access to if they did not have a disability. So basically, where they're typically developing neighbors and brothers and sisters and cousins going to school, and can we make sure that they have access to those same programs? So my objectives today are to introduce the building blocks framework, to discuss some strategies that can help us implement inclusion, and then to talk about a strategy for planning for inclusion. One of the things that often happens, and when we talk about inclusion with people, is they get this idea that inclusion just means being there. But we really want to talk about what does inclusion mean, and that inclusion is more than being there, but inclusion is being there and having support and providing the instruction that children need in order to make meaningful progress towards their important educational outcomes. So what does inclusion mean, and what does it mean for a child to be successful in an early childhood classroom. And we know that in every individual we talk to, and we've talked to not millions, but we've talked to lots of people now about what their definition of inclusion is. But I like to base of it that inclusion is about belonging and participating in a diverse society, and I think that, to me, the key word there is participation. And we want to see and that's what Building Blocks is all about, is how can we create strategies that facilitate participation in whatever setting the family or the team decides that the child should be in. And then we want to think from because one of the things that we know, and one of the things that guides all of our work, is that children with disabilities are children first. And so we want to make sure that we say, what does it mean for for a young child to be successful? And we say, well, first they need to have a true sense of belonging, that there's genuine learning going on, and that they have an opportunity to build relationships that can turn into friendships. So just to talk a minute about what inclusion means, and I'm sure that many of you will have your own definitions of inclusion, and I would encourage you to either add your own as questions, or even challenge these if you have other opinions. Is that I think one definition that my colleague Ilene and I developed is that inclusion is not a set of strategies or a placement issue. Inclusion is about belonging to a community, a group of friends, a school community, or a neighborhood. So, it really is not about school. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes people get caught up in, at least in our school district. People talk about, the placement being inclusive. And when what's your placement? Well, you're in inclusion. You're in third grade, but you're in inclusion. And so sometimes when I go to talk to PTSAs, and I'll say to them, they'll say they're an inclusive school, and I'll say, how many inclusive students do you have? And they'll say, we have 13. And I said, I thought you told me you had 300 children in the school. So if you have an inclusive school, then you should have 300 inclusion students. 13 may have disabilities, 13 may have IEPs, but if you go to an inclusive school, then you're an inclusion student. I think it's also important to remember what the law of the land is, and from a very important case that came out of the Ninth Circuit, the O'Berry case, the judge there was quite clear and said inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. And so what that means to us when we're working in inclusive placements is that we need to remember that is the law of the land. That should be the starting place, and that when people are choosing to not include students, that we have to realize that that's an adult decision that's being made to not provide children with the amount of support that they need to be included. One of the questions I often get, because people know that I'm pretty rabid about this topic, is, well, you don't really think that child can be included. And I say, yeah, I believe every child can be included. And the question then becomes, are we willing to provide the amount of support that will be necessary to make sure that a child can be included successfully? If not, we have to say, okay, that's a decision we've made, but that's a decision that we made based on a support need, not about the child necessarily. Now, just to spend a few more minutes about the definition of inclusion before we get into the actual text of Building Blocks. This is a framework for inclusion that my colleagues Kat Peck, Debbie Staub, and Chris Angelucci and I developed. To try to answer that question of what do children learn in inclusive placements? Because one of the things that, when we started doing inclusive practices, one of the questions that people would ask is, well, why is this important? What's the value added? And so we were really trying to think about what the value added is for inclusion. And so first of all, we realized that inclusive education, inclusive instruction takes place in a community of practice, And what that community of practice is made up of is participation in valued routines, rituals, and activities. And then the value added is, when we look at these three domains of outcomes for children, that we always in special education we're very good at the skills domain. We're terrific at writing very detailed educational plans that we call IEPs or IFSPs. And we're very good at outlining in amazing detail what children will be learning. But what we're not as good at is thinking about the social emotional part of that, and in that we think about membership and relationships. So how do we ensure that children are members of the community, members of the classroom, and we actually look at for evidence that the child is a member. Is the child's name on a cubby? Is a child assigned a job? Does a child have a place at the snack table? And then we also look at relationships and the kinds of relationships we look at. We look at a range of relationships that children have the opportunity to form. And we look at them in terms of, is a child given the opportunity to be a helper? Are they always receiving help and then they're a helpee? Do they have peer relationships? Do they have kind of hanging out relationships? And then we also look at, do they have relationships that are conflictual, and do they learn how to solve conflict, which we all know is an important part of daily life for some of us anyway. And we don't have a category in there that we call friend, because we think a friend is someone that is made up of all those relationships, all those types of relationships. That sometimes you're a peer, and sometimes you're a helper, and sometimes you're just hanging out, and sometimes you give help, and sometimes you receive help from your friends. So, and sometimes you have conflict with your friends, and then you know how to solve that. So, moving on now. So now we're going to get to the building blocks text. So again, our goal is to meet children where they are, and help them make meaningful progress towards important educational outcomes. And so we're really committed to saying that building blocks can help all children participate and thrive in early learning programs. So when we start talking about what that means for participating and thriving in early learning programs, it comes down to something that I talk to all my students about, all my students who are becoming teachers, is for every activity that we're planning in an early childhood environment or in an elementary school environment, we want to say we want to come down to these basic questions, and these basic questions are: what are you going to teach? How are you going to teach those skills and behaviors? And how will I know that my teaching has been effective? And to me, that's the core of what we're doing. So when I see a child at a group activity, and a teacher may say to me, well, is it important for this child to go to group? And I answer back to them, well, what are you teaching at group? And if what's happening at group is part of your curriculum, then yeah, it's important for that child to be there, because otherwise they're missing out part of the lesson. But then we need to follow up with that and say, but what are you teaching there, and how are you going to teach those skills and behaviors? So being there is not enough necessarily for a child with disability to learn the lesson you're trying to teach. And then you need to follow up with, how will I know that the teaching has been effective? Are we taking data? Are we taking child progress data to demonstrate that child is making meaningful progress towards that important educational outcome? Same thing with a child. If a teacher says to me, well, Bobby never goes to art because he doesn't like art. And then I say, is art part of your curriculum? What is being taught in the art center at your school? If part of your curriculum is embedded in that center, which in most early learning programs it is, then a child can't opt out of art any more than we would let a fifth grader opt out of social studies or history. So it's important for us to, as we think about how an early learning environment is set up, to ensure that we are making sure that children access all parts of that early learning environment, and that we're really thinking systematically about what we are teaching. So this is the this is the building blocks model. So some people, I'm assuming that most of you have heard of RTI or MTSS, so multiple tiered systems of support, and building blocks predates that term, but is an MTSS. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is that building blocks is a model that builds on a universal intervention, and that universal intervention is a high-quality early childhood program. Now, if any of you on the call are from elementary school, I would encourage you to cross out where it says early childhood and write in elementary, because I believe that the model has validity into elementary school as well. But the idea is that a high-quality early childhood program is necessary for all children, but may not be sufficient for all children to learn what we want them to learn. Some children are going to need some curriculum modifications and adaptations, and then we'll be fine. Some children may need embedded learning opportunities, and some children may need child-focused instructional strategies. And we're going to get into all of these in a lot of detail, so I'm not talking about them right now. But the important thing to remember is that just because you have a diagnosis of a disability doesn't mean that you jump up to the top of the top block. That, I think about a little boy that was in our program for a long time, and he had pretty significant autism, and he was very, very motorically gifted. And so when it came to learning how to swim, he didn't need special ed swimming lessons. He just needed high-quality swimming lessons, someone who would explain what they wanted him to do. Now, when it came to social and communicative behaviors, he really needed child-focused instructional strategies to learn those skills. But we don't want to assume that just because you have a disability that you can't benefit from these other levels of the blocks. And the other thing that's important is that the blocks are additive, and so you can't do high-quality child-focused instructional strategies without a high-quality early childhood program. So that, the high-quality early childhood program may not be sufficient, but it is necessary. And so with that, we're going to dive into the rest of the blocks. So the foundation, like I said, is this high-quality early childhood program. And again, we really are clear that a high-quality early childhood program is necessary but may not be sufficient for all children. And so what does that mean? A high-quality early childhood program is a program where children are safe, where the environment is engaging, where the environment is responsive. So that means that we treat all child behavior as an intent to interact, and that it's culturally and linguistically relevant. And so we have materials and activities across the day that allow children to interact with each other and receive the support that they need from adults in order to learn the lessons that are planned for them. The second step of the model, and if for people that are interested in more information about that model, about that block in particular, I have some references at the end of the talk that really talk a lot about that bottom block. I'm not going to talk that much about the bottom block, but I'll point out the references at the very end of the talk. Now, one of the blocks I am going to talk a lot about is this block that we call the curricular modifications and adaptations. And we all know that that we all use curricular modifications and adaptations all the time. And one of my favorites in preschool is the carpet square. So when we think about why we use a carpet square certainly isn't providing any cushion to someone's bottom. The purpose of a carpet square is to really teach children where they're supposed to sit in space, where they belong, what's their space and what's their neighbor's space. Because when you make that transition from preschool to kindergarten, and at least in schools in our region, one of the things you lose is your carpet square. So you go from having a very well-defined space to the teacher saying, okay, everyone come up here on the rug, and you have to kind of negotiate that without any modification. So when we think about what is a curricular modification, it's a change to an ongoing classroom activity or material in order to facilitate or maximize a child's participation. And we like to think of them as their little effort that get big change. So small change, big outcomes. Sorry that last slide didn't really come out so well. So then we want to think about, when do I modify the curriculum? We modify the curriculum when the child is not participating in a meaningful way. So another example that we use a lot is in our program we have some children who are a little grabby, and maybe not in your programs, but one of the things that happens is if we're working on a project at a table, a child may not understand what is theirs and what is someone else's. And so what we may do is put all of the materials that belong to that one child, that the child can use without asking permission, on a tray or a placemat, and that defines the space for the child. It's a very easy modification, but it really helps that child learn, if it's not on my tray or my placemat, I need to ask. If it is on my tray or placemat, I can use it without permission. So the things about curriculum modifications is that they're simple but intentional. And, it goes back to this issue that instruction is intentional. And so curricular modifications and adaptations are a type of intentional instruction. So they're simple, they're easy to implement, there's usually no additional resources, and you can use more than one, and it can be used with more than one child. But intentional in that there's thoughtful planning, there's deliberate implementation, and there should be immediate impact, or I would argue that it's not the right modification. So based on some research that we did as part of the Early Childhood Research Institute on Inclusion, we came up with, based on a number of observations, interviews, and focus groups, we said that there were 8 different types of curricular modifications. And I'm going to go through, you can see them on the screen, and I'm going to go through each of these individually. So the first one is environmental arrangement. So here's an example of, you can see the tray idea here, that, some children have things on their tray, there's some things in the middle of the table, and then they're sharing some materials. But we're basically altering the physical, social, and temporal environment to promote participation, engagement, and learning. So we're arranging the environment to facilitate participation and engagement. The second is materials adaptation. And so we're modifying materials so that children can participate independently as possible. So you can see with this little boy who has some motor difficulties, they've done 2 things. They have a clip to hold his paper to hold his paper so that he doesn't have to support it. And then he also is writing at an angle rather than flat on the table, that makes it easier for him to write. You could say there's a third thing, and it looks to me like he's writing with a marker, which means that he doesn't have to press down as hard as he would if he was using a crayon or other writing utensil. So again, the idea here is to say, what can I do for the materials? How can I change the materials to help the child be as independent and successful as possible? The third thing is to simplify the activity. And so I'm simplifying a complicated task by breaking it into smaller parts or reducing the number of steps. So, for example, if this child is putting, I'm not quite sure why we'd have this child do this task now that I'm looking at it, but if the child is putting lids into these little lids into this big container, rather than having them do all of them, I'm simplifying the activity by having them just do a few. And so it's very clear that they're only doing, a few of these at a time. Special equipment is another type of curricular modification, and so special equipment or adaptive devices, such as in this case she's using a Dynabox, or now iPads are often used. I would also include in there any kind of specialized seating devices or specialized eating devices. So special or adaptive devices that allow a child to participate or increase the level of a child's participation. So one of the things I want to say about this type of curricular modification, that this specialized equipment is certainly important, but that I also want to really make the point that there are lots of curricular devices that are not specialized. There's a lot of curricular modifications that are not specialized, that don't need a specialist, such as a speech-language pathologist or an occupational therapist, to come in and prescribe it. That sometimes we can have very easy curricular modifications that can make just as big of a bang as something that is a piece of specialized equipment. Peer support is our next kind of curricular modification. Utilizing peers to help children learn important objectives, whether it's helping them learn how to play or helping them clean up, or having buddies to help children make good transitions, and whether that peer support is very formalized in terms of peer-mediated intervention a la Phil Strain, or if it's more informal, like it is here, where children are playing together and helping each other. Adult support. So clearly, there are times where having an adult in the program can intervene to support the child's participation in learning. But again, it's just one of these types of environmental modifications or curriculum modifications, and it should not always be the go-to curricular modification. Child preference. If the child is not taking advantage of the available opportunities, you can identify and integrate child's preferences into that activity. So bikes are a big preference, preference for us outside, but even more simple things. So if I have a child who's very interested in dogs or cats, but not so interested in art, I can have either pictures of dogs and cats that we're decorating that day, or I might have a plastic dog and cat that we're painting with, or I might have books about dogs and cats if I want to increase their time in the literacy center. I might have figurines of dogs and cats over in the block area if I want them to be playing over there. So it's really a matter of making sure that we're using preferences in a way to make the different parts of the classroom and different activities more interesting to and accessible to children. And then finally, this is one of my favorite ones, which is this idea of invisible support, which is purposely arranging naturally occurring events within the activity. So, for example, when we have children line up and they're lining up against a wall, they're getting a straighter line than if they're just lining up somewhere else in the environment. We have a wonderful video of this where the children are scooping ice cream to make a milkshake in a classroom, and so the child who has not very good motor skills is in the middle of the group, so that by the time it gets to him, the ice cream's pretty soft and quite easy to scoop. So in the same way, if you're thinking about a mealtime in a Head Start classroom where children are serving themselves, that you would want to think about where you start a dish so that a child with not as good of motor skills can be successful because the dish is not quite so full or not quite so heavy and easier to manage. But the big thing about all of these curricular modifications, whether it's one or many, is that it's a small change for a big impact. And when we think about curricular modifications, what we want them to do is to help children access the curriculum. And you know, in early childhood, one of the things that's sometimes challenging for us as early educators is that we have to reframe how we think about what we're doing every day. So when I'm thinking about my curriculum, I'm thinking about the activity that I have going on at small group. That may be part of my curriculum. And when I'm engaged in an activity at small group, I have to be thinking about what I'm teaching in that activity and make the distinction between the activity and the instructional objective. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. So the next block is what we call embedded learning opportunities. And for any of you that are familiar with strategies that are sometimes called naturalistic teaching, milieu teaching, those are like what those are examples of embedded learning opportunities. So as you'll notice, because this is an MTSS model, that one of the things that happens is at each level of the model becomes a little bit more intrusive, a little bit more directive, instruction becomes a little bit more explicit. So that's why what we want to make sure with this model is that we're not over-prompting children, that we're not limiting their access to their typically developing peers and to the ongoing valued rituals and routines in the classroom by providing more instruction or more support than they need. So, but embedded learning opportunities are short teaching episodes that go on within activities and routines. Now, whereas curricular modifications really work on helping children with participate more fully, when we make this step into embedded learning opportunities, we're really now talking about individual learning objectives. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're IEP objectives, because we can certainly do embedded learning opportunities for a child who does not have an IEP or an IFSP. It may be that a child hasn't learned a outcome objective from an early learning program or Head Start that we want to focus on. And what we talk about here is that we're teaching teachers to embed a teaching loop into ongoing classroom activities and routines. So what is a teaching loop? Well, a teaching loop, a discrete trial is a form of a teaching loop. A teaching loop is just a way of framing an instructional interaction. And so a teaching loop might be, or when I say a discrete trial is one example of that. If you think about what a discrete trial is that it's a way of framing an instructional interaction that includes an instruction, a prompt if necessary, and remember a prompt is just providing the child with a little scaffolding or extra information to make sure that they can answer correctly before they respond. The child's response, and we always put that in there because as early childhood educators, sometimes we like to talk so much that we forget to let the child have a turn. And a consequence and a brief intertrial interval. So one of the things that we work on when we're looking at having people do embedded instruction in early childhood settings is to ensure that they close this loop. So when I give an instruction, I make sure there's a consequence. So if I say, I'm trying to teach a child the name of colors, and I've got, they're building with Legos, and I've got the yellow Lego that I think this child really wants, and I hold it up and say, what color? And they say yellow. Then when I give it to them and say, you're right, this is the yellow Lego, and give it to them, I am closing that loop. So one of the things we want to make sure when we talk about teaching loops is that we close that instructional loop, that there's a instruction and then there's also a consequence. Now, if I hold up the yellow Lego and the child says, I say, what color? And the child says green, I then need to close the loop in a different way. And we close the loop at that point with what we call an error correction. And basically, we would say to the child, this is yellow, say yellow, when the child says yellow, and then I give them the yellow block, okay? So error corrections are important. Remember, instruction is intentional and includes feedback as part of that. So another way of thinking about the teaching loop, and this description of a teaching loop comes from Kathy Barnard's work in promoting first relationships. And she defines a teaching loop also as 4 parts and says alerting, basically getting a child's attention, instruction, child response, and adult feedback. So when we start talking about this embedded learning opportunities, what we need to make sure is that opportunities are important, but instruction is intentional. And so it's not just having an opportunity to provide instruction, it's actually providing this intentional instruction. So what are some advantages of ELO? One is that there are minimal changes to the classroom activities. So I'm not pulling children away from the activity. I'm not pulling children away from their peers and doing anything special or fancy. I'm letting the children tell me what they're interested in by the activities that they choose, and I'm embedding my instruction into their activity. Because of that, children are more motivated to participate, and learning should be enhanced. Because I'm teaching the skills in the natural contexts, I don't have to worry as much about generalization or maintenance. And then the skills are used, hopefully, with a variety of people and materials because they're taught that way. So I'm teaching in a more natural way, which means that hopefully children will demonstrate their skills in a more natural way. Now, as any of you know who work in an early childhood program, early childhood programs are busy, complicated, complex environments. And so one of the reasons that people sometimes shy away from doing embedded learning opportunities is that they're hard to plan and they're hard to track. So, one of the things about doing instruction where I take someone over to a table and do what I call decontextualized teaching, where I sit down and I may do 10 minutes of very one-on-one direct instruction on something, is that it's easy to track that, and it looks very intense. But it may not be as valuable in the long run as doing this instruction that's embedded into the environment. So one of the things we talk about in building blocks, and I actually think that it's perhaps the most important thing you can take away from building blocks, the most important tool that you can take away from building blocks, because it's helping you plan when instruction happens, and it's what we call an activity matrix. So an activity matrix is a way to organize teaching and learning opportunities. It maximizes learning time by planning, and by making sure that planning happens, that we plan for instruction across all days all days and all classroom activities. In the old days, when I first started doing work in special education, I would go into classrooms and there would be language time and motor time and writing time, and luckily we don't do that very much anymore, or we shouldn't be doing that, because we know that all the time is language time. But when we say, well, all the time is language time, one of the things that happens is we sometimes don't do a very good job actually implementing the intervention because it becomes so ingrained that it doesn't. We're not very good about implementing it. So what an activity matrix does is it allows us to plan when the instruction is going to happen. So here's an example of an activity matrix. And this is for one child and one child who has an IEP. So what we would do is we would take Bonnie's IEP, and we're basically creating an IEP at a glance. And so as you can see, we put all the domains in which Bonnie has an IEP objective across the top. And then we take our schedule and we put that down the side. And just for Bonnie, this is only Bonnie now, we're saying, okay, when am I going to work on these different skills? So when am I going to work on imitation? And this teacher has decided that she's going to work on imitation during table work. When am I going to work on turning to name? Well, this teacher has decided she's going to work on that during free play. Okay, she's going to work on drinking from a cup at at snack time. Okay. Now, it's up. There's no one right way to do this, right? That basically different people will have different activity matrices that look different ways, and I'm going to show you some real ones that people use here in a minute. But what this does for you is it allows you to look at her whole IEP, because if your IEPs are anything like our IEPs now, they are very complicated and long and bulky documents. So the idea that any teacher is going to use them on a daily basis they become a little less user-friendly. So this is basically trying to help us remind us what's on everyone's IEP so that we can do that instruction in a meaningful way. So let me show you the next idea, which is this would be an activity matrix for the whole class. So I've taken everything from Bonnie's IEP and I've put it in Bonnie's column here. But then I'm going to do the same thing for Sophie and the same things for Miles and the same things for Adam. And what I'm basically creating here is an IEP at a glance for my whole class. So that when I'm planning, I can say, okay, well, I know that Bonnie's working on puzzles here, so I need to make sure I have puzzles available every day at play. She's also learning to play games. So how am I sure that I have some games out so she can access that and work on it? So here's an example. I'm going to show you a couple examples, and I'll go back to that other one. Here are some examples of what real activity matrices look like in different classes. So here's a teacher who has made a dramatic play activity matrix. So she's just taken a whiteboard. She has the 3 children on there and just the things that they're going to work on. So Anna's working on using 2 hands together. Xander's working on joining in on play. Okay. Now here's one she did the same thing for outdoor play, and she's got a piece of white paper, a butcher paper that she has posted outdoors. And what that does is it takes the onus off the head teacher to be the only person who knows what instruction needs to be happening. And it makes it the responsibility of everyone on the team who's out there to be making sure that instruction is happening. And here's an example of a smaller version, and this is a version similar to how we will often use it, so that we basically make a table on Word and put all the children's names and activities on there. And here's one more example. This one actually I took a picture of. This is one that's currently being used in one of our classrooms. And so the children's names are up here, and then here's their schedule. And these are IEP objectives that they're working on. The colors don't mean anything. The first time I used this picture, people were trying to figure out the difference between the pink stickies and the green stickies, and I think the difference is they ran out of pink stickies. So the colors don't mean anything. But what this means is that when the team sits down to plan activities, they're looking at these objectives to make sure that they have the activities planned so that children can practice these goals and objectives every single day. When we first started using this activity matrix in our classrooms, we had a little bit of pushback, as you can imagine, because teachers hadn't been doing this. And so we said, no, everyone must turn in an activity matrix. But what was interesting is after that first year of saying that, we had teachers who had been teaching for a very long time who told us that this was the best thing they'd done in many years, because what they found was that in the past, they would be using activity matrix, they would be getting to report writing time when it was time to do a child's progress report for the quarterly progress report, and they would have noticed that they forgot some activities, some objectives. Some things hadn't been worked on because no one can obviously remember all those objectives. But now that they're all right in front of you every day, people feel that they are more able to implement all of the children's objectives. So in just thinking about how you would start doing this, I think the best way to start implementing an activity matrix in your classroom is to start with one child. So you pick one child, either someone who has a very challenging IEP or potentially someone whose IEP is just coming up. So, the next IEP that you do, you say, okay, I'm going to start with that one. And you take their objectives and you say, okay, here's my schedule. When am I going to implement these different skills? When am I going to implement them? Now, again, people say, well, we implement them all day long. And I say, that's fantastic. But what I want to make sure that if I come into your classroom that I can be guaranteed to see specially designed instruction and data collection on that specially designed instruction on this goal and objective at that time. It's wonderful that we provide children opportunities to practice all day long. So if you look like this at this example for Mia, we're sorting a collection by color. I'm sure she does get opportunities to practice on things like that all day long. But when am I going to make sure that she's actually not just having opportunities to practice, but is having intentional instruction on that objective? And according to this, it would be during this classroom activity. Okay. So the last block of our tower here is what we call child-focused instructional strategies. And those are things that, as special education teachers, we may be very familiar with. So a child-focused instructional strategy either addresses a unique learning objective, that is something that other children in the class may not be working on. It requires more systematic and or intensive instruction. It's more intensive specially designed instruction, and it requires more data collection and planning. It may also be something where everyone else has been working on it, and the child the target child has not made the gains that you would expect to see. So, for example, we know that one of the outcomes that we want to see for every child in Head Start is that they can write their name by the end of Head Start. So people practice that all day long, or many times a day. Some classrooms have children sign in when they come in. Some classrooms, in most classrooms, they do some kind of art activity every day, and you have to practice writing your name on your art activity. You write your name on your picture or whatever you've done that day. And so most children learn just through that kind of practice how to write their names. But let's say we're 6 weeks before the end of Head Start, and we have a child who really hasn't made much practice in writing his or her name. So at that point, we might choose to do child-focused instructional strategies. We might pull that child aside for 5 minutes a day, work one-on-one with them on writing to improve their skills in a more quick and explicit way on that specific skill. So it's not that other children, it's not that handwriting is unique, but it's that this child requires more explicit instruction than other children have required. For some children, it may be unique. For example, teaching imitation. Most children don't need to learn how to imitate. Children with autism, we know, do need to learn how to imitate. And imitation is a pivotal skill. Once they learn how to imitate, they can use that imitation to teach them lots of other skills. So basically, in summing up, we see that building blocks provides us a framework for planning and teaching. It builds on a high-quality early childhood program. It also helps us think about different individualized levels of support because, I still hear from parents sometimes who say, I need to make a choice between instruction or inclusion, and I don't know how to do that. And I'm always very sad when I hear parents say that because intensive instruction should be part of inclusion if necessary, and when necessary. And so instruction should take place in inclusive settings. And I think building blocks gives us a good way of figuring out how to do that in a way that's child friendly. So like I said, I have some resources here for you. The first resource is this ECLKC. So if you're not a Head Start program, you may not know this website. It's a fantastic website, and it's the Head Start website. And on that website are all the resources from the National Center on Quality Teaching and Learning. And basically, the Quality Center on Teaching and Learning has developed many, I don't even know how many, instructional suites on things like on instruction and every step of the building blocks model. They call it the house, so they've adapted the model a little bit. But there's much instruction about every step of the building blocks model, and there's quite a bit on that bottom block on setting the foundation. The second reference here is a program called CEFL that came out of Vanderbilt, which is a center for social and emotional foundations in learning, and also has some fantastic resources, and all of these are free. And the third one is a program called the Head Start Center for Inclusion, and again has really fantastic resources. But the great thing about this first one, the ECLKC program, is website, is that it has, if you're in a position where you're doing any training, it has training materials ready for you to use, and they want you to use them. And they're called 15-minute in-services, and so they're really short little programs that you can use with your staff, and they're really quite excellent. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left, and so I wonder if anyone has any questions.
And if you do, you can type them in the chat window.
So one of the questions that people will sometimes ask us is about confidentiality and the activity matrix. And so I've answered this question many, many times, and we have people in Head Start programs using this all the time because everyone's name is on it. And it doesn't say anything like, my name is Darla and I have autism. It just says Darla, just in the same way that your job board has a child's name on it, or anything else. So we haven't had any problems with that issue, because it's not about kind of labeling what's wrong with a child. It's going from a place of strength, of talking about what children are working on. So we haven't had any problems with confidentiality with any Head Starts, or we have a state pre-K program. So I'm hoping that you won't have any of that either. Don't be shy now. Any other questions?
Okay, Ilene, I think we're good. Thank you for a great session. Boy, that book is really, it's been on the market for quite a while. I'd forgotten about it. It has a lot of really great information. And
well, don't tell me to update it, because we're afraid we're going to get that call any day to do a new version. But I think it's really helpful. I'm glad people like it.
Yes, no, I have used it. You're making me think I need to bring it out for someone I was trying to help out today. So thank you for that prompt. For the audience, I'll be following up with you about today's session by the end of the week, maybe later today, and you will get your certificate of attendance. You'll get the copy of the PowerPoint and the recording. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at barb@mcie.org. And I want to thank you again, Ilene, and everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Barb.
Okay, I'll talk to you later, Ilene. Bye-bye.